And we also have, it's an hourly hybrid where it's kind of a retainer. So some of our clients, they have ongoing work for, I almost want to say years, at least months. And so what we came up with was the idea of prepaying for packages of hours, where you can say, hey, you don't even know what you're going to do. We don't know what you want to do. We know that you're doing some social, you're doing some app stuff, you're doing landing pages, you're doing some conversion optimization, you have a bunch of little mini projects, and you have your own clients that you're dealing with. So there's going to be tons of stuff coming our way. Let's create an hourly retainer. And the higher the amount of hours, the lower that hourly rate is.
Welcome to Business Ninjas, brought to you by WriteForMe, where you'll hear from business leaders who are out there growing their business and slaying it every day. Learn from the masters. Let's get started.
Welcome to another episode of Business Ninjas. I'm here with Al Fard, who's the co-founder and CEO at CreateApe. Hey, Al, how's it going?
Going good. Thank you.
Good. Great to have you here. Looking forward to talking with you. Tell me a little bit about CreateApe and what you do over there.
Yeah, so CreateApe is a full-service UX UI agency. So basically, user experience design, user interface design, and development. That's really our core product offering of what we do. We're also on the UX side known a lot when it comes to research and ideation, which is really the foundation of good design projects. You want to do that. So in a nutshell, that's what we do.
Great. Tell me a little bit about the customer journey. You know, when somebody comes to you and they've got a challenge, what are some of the challenges that they have? And then what's step 1, 2, and 3 for you to get to a scope, and what does that look like?
So I think the first thing is, it kind of depends on the client, because there are different types, but I'm going to break it down into 2 for now, just because it makes it easier. There's startups and those that would kind of fall in that vein. And then there is more established companies. And there's similarities in what they need, but a startup's needs are a little bit different because they're really looking at constraints around budget and time and trying to find intelligent ways from get to point A to point B. And I think that, the idea of an MVP really makes more sense to them than maybe more established companies. And so, I think one of the ways that, CreateApe stands out is that we understand what viable really means, because it's not based off of our opinion or the client's opinion. It's based off of the users. Who are your users? Who are you going after? And so when we do our foundational, research and ideation, we're able to extrapolate from that. Okay, here are the core users. Here are who is the company, who they're actually targeting. And then based on that, we're able to come back and say, hey, guess what, company or client, this is what you're trying to do, and here's how you get there. And so for startups, that's very, very important, because as you guys know, startups they can't waste. they need to make sure everything counts. My career over the last 22 years, I've been part of a lot of startups that were brilliant ideas. They failed, and they didn't fail for any other reason that it wasn't executed well. And part of that execution was that an MVP just wasn't there. And, you hear like, oh, I guess it wasn't a good idea. No, it was a great idea. It just wasn't viable enough. You just didn't go far enough to do it, or you tried to go way too far and we weren't able to launch in time, so time to market. So I think that's one. And then on the more established companies, while they're not as constrained when it comes to time and budget, what they are constrained with is, I think, in my opinion, a little bit more around the vision and understanding the value behind the foundation of research and ideation of good UX, right? 10 years ago, UX didn't really exist. It was just starting to kind of come together. Back in the day, it was like, I'm a web designer. When I first started my career at GSN and Sony, I was a web designer. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago that it's like, wait a second, like the user, we need to solve the user's problems. And so I think that for more established companies, where we tend to stand out is the idea that holistically, UX designers say that we're advocates for the user. But what I like to say is we are advocates for the user within the business goals. And that is, I think, a big thing for our more established companies that we really bring to the forefront and say, look, what are your business goals? And now I'm going to go find a way to marry that to your user goals and find that synergy. And sometimes those things are incredibly at odds. And so that's the challenge. That's why we get paid the big bucks. Like, how do we find a way to make it so that the user goes through that journey, and at the end of it, tweets about it or shares on, Instagram, what a great product, service, whatever it is. So those are kind of the two that we get. And I think that, a lot of times, I mean, still nowadays, really most of our clients come through word of mouth. So my network or clients that we've worked with already, they're just referring us to other clients. We really don't do a ton of advertising or, outbound or things like that.
I love the approach of how you take it down to the level of marrying up good user experience with business goals, because that's where it all gets expressed anyway. Let's double click on that a little bit. And how do you help a client get to that point? Because a lot of times people are in love with their idea and they really need some coaching to get from, I've got a really good idea, to this actually really needs to make business sense, and helping them get it to make business sense. It's almost like you're part therapist and what you do.
That's true. It's a good question. And it's funny, after 2 decades plus in the space, I can tell you some stories. I mean, I remember one time I was on a project and one of the stakeholders had a dream. I'm not joking. She had a dream. And the next day during our meeting, we need to change all of this stuff. I had a dream and this is what it needs to be. I'd never experienced anything like that before. My mouth kind of dropped. And, those that know me, they'll start laughing when they hear me do things like, interesting. They're like, that's code for Al saying that's the worst idea ever. And he's trying to find a nice way to bring that out. So, I think one in going through things like that, or going through situations where, a stakeholder will say, well, when I go online, blank, how do you get them to be like, listen, it's not really about what you think. And it's not even what I think. I mean, I'm going to probably approach it a little more holistically, and I have a bit more experience to go from an industry standard standpoint, but it's about what your users want. And so to kind of dig deeper on how do we get there, the biggest thing that we do is I say it's research and ideation. We've actually productized it into what we call the CreateApe Jungle Guide. And what the CreateApe Jungle Guide is it basically says, we're going to do the following things. We're going to first do a heuristic evaluation on your product and brand. Where are you? What are you doing? What are you trying to accomplish? We're going to look at your competitors. What are they doing? What are the opportunities there? Is there low-hanging fruit? Is there, can we be opportunities to get market share quicker? We're going to look at things like, is this a redesign? Is this something that already exists? And if so, let's look at the existing data. Like, what are the current analytics say? So again, we want to look at quantitative, which is analytical data, and then we want to look at qualitative. And that is, once we've established who your personas are and who your true users are, we're going to go and interview them. If we have access via you, the client, to interview them, great. If we don't, we'll find a way. Whether it's usabilitytesting.com, Usability Hub, or even going on LinkedIn and just offering some free Starbucks gift cards so I can get 30 minutes of someone's time that matches the persona data, we're going to get a 5 to 10 people group, and we're going to ask them non-leading questions so that we can identify, does this make sense? Does this work? And as we start to do all these things, we start to build this bigger picture so that when we come back to the client, we say, hey, we've done all of these things, and based on this, here's where you're at. You're currently doing this. This is what you should be doing. And everything that we say you should be doing, it's not opinion, it's not conjecture, it's backed by data. And you're going to see lines back to that data and be like, oh, interesting. You talked to 10 people and 7 out of 10 said they had no idea that this was even a service we offered, or they felt like the cost was too high or whatever. And so when we come back and we say, this is what you should do, it's backed by that data. And how we present that is in various ways. Sometimes it's in wireframes or user flows, user stories, et cetera, saying here's what you need to do and here's why. The other thing that's really cool, I think, about our Jungle Guide for our clients is that we don't just look at what you're trying to accomplish. When we look at what you're currently doing, we also look for that low-hanging fruit. So I'll be on calls with clients and say, great, you're excited, I'm excited, we're going to do this big redesign in the next 8 months. That's awesome. But guess what? Do this tomorrow. If you don't have anything to do it, give me access to your account. I'll do it for you because it'll take me 5 minutes to do it. And by moving this button over here and changing the word of this to this, you're going to get an increase in conversion. I don't have time to do A/B testing around this. It's probably not even in the budget, but I guarantee you it's going to be better than what you're doing. So we look at that type of low-hanging fruit, and our clients love this because they're like, great, because they're going to see a lift if they do these things, even while we're building the bigger picture. And back to that initial question that you asked, when a stakeholder, especially a very opinionated stakeholder, an executive says, well, I think it should be this way, we can say, hey, no worries. Guess what? We've tested this with real users, and let me bring you along the journey on why we should do it this way. And it either validates what you're saying or it invalidates it. And we're going to say that in a way that really makes that stakeholder not feel like he's wrong, but that there's a pivot. And you know, hopefully they're appreciative of, okay, I can pivot in doing this because it's going to mean X for me. So that's really how we go about solving that problem. And it's so far, since we've, you know, kind of created the Jungle Guide, we've had literally 100% success rate. Like, we haven't had one project fail because there's a reason UX exists. If you do your research, you do your ideation, you're going to be successful. Then it's just execution at that point.
I love it. I love the whole data-driven approach, and I love the Jungle Guide that you guys have productized that. Tell me, you know, how long does it take to create a Jungle Guide, and what do you need from a client to provide them with a Jungle Guide to kickstart a project?
So typically we have three kind of tiers of Jungle Guide. There's kind of a tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3. We internally call the tier 3 the El Dorado, just to build off of this whole Jungle Guide, CreateApe kind of theme. And an El Dorado is what we've been gaining a lot of lately. We tend to do a lot of those now. And the El Dorado is pretty big. They generally take anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks to accomplish. The other Jungle Guides can take about 2 to 4 weeks. And essentially what we need from the client is a couple things. Number one, we need access to what they currently have, and access to them and stakeholders that are on their team, and access, if possible, to existing customers, users, etc. Outside of that, we really don't need anything else. So for a lot of times, the level of effort that a client needs to bring to do a Jungle Guide is actually pretty low. It's, you know, let us interview you and members of your team. We're going to need a kickoff meeting. We'll probably need like 1 or 2 meetings a week over the next 2 to 4 weeks. And we need access to your Google Analytics, maybe some other things depending on what you have. Do you have Hotjar running? Things like that. Anything that you have will take. Sometimes we do get clients, especially for new projects where there is no existing analytics. No problem. We're going to go based off of industry standard analytics, and we're going to try to go look at your competitors and see what are they doing. And there are nifty tools out there in the web here in 2023 where we can find out what your competitors are doing. I don't want to get Big Brother, but we can get a little bit of, we know the gist of their analytics. So we can kind of see that, and we're able to leverage that and say, hey, here's your opportunity. Here's what you need to do. So it's not a huge investment of their time. I had one client recently that we've been working with say to us, you know, they were like, hey, this was painless. This was really painless. I thought it was going to be a lot more and I'd have to do a ton of meetings, and you really don't need to. The other thing that our clients are really loving is at the end, when we come back with our recommendations for the low-hanging fruit and the bigger project, the approach that we take is, if we do it, this is what we would do and why. But if for some reason you don't want to go with us because maybe you have an offshore team that they can do a good job and they're admittedly cheaper than we are, awesome. This is a cool guide that will keep everybody within the guardrails. So they're not going to, if you get something that is outside of what we're showing you, question it. If it's smaller, something's not right. If it's way bigger, something's not right. And so our clients really appreciate that because it builds trust with them.
For sure. It's such a great idea, and it's a great way to lead into the bigger project. And then, so when you go from the Jungle Guide now to the bigger project, there's got to be some kind of ideation kind of phase of this to get everybody aligned on the scope of what you're going to be doing. Are you building wireframes at that point and kind of walking people through the experience, or tell me a little bit about what that's like for the client?
Yeah, so essentially, you know, once we're done with the Jungle Guide, it's actually funny because in the bigger project, you're going to see a timeline. And we actually put research and ideation in there, and we show a line where it says, you are here. Like, you've completed your research and ideation. It's done. You check that box. You don't have to worry about it anymore. You got it. But once you start doing the design phase, you're right. Normally, we then move into wireframing. And again, this is where things get a little bit tricky because it depends on the client and what we heard during the Jungle Guide. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? What are some constraints that we need to be aware of? So for example, if there's a client that has a time constraint or a budgetary constraint, we may skip certain steps. We may say, look, ideally, yes, you should do wireframing, then you create a prototype, then you test the prototype, then you take the feedback from that, you reiterate the wireframes, you rinse and repeat until you finally get things perfect. Make sure your development team's involved, let them give their 2 cents, and then move to high fidelity mockups and rinse, repeat everything I just said all over again until you finally hand it off in a very waterfall format to your development team so that they can do what they need to do, then QA, then pre-launch, post-launch, et cetera. Most clients don't have the ideal. Nobody has the budget or time to do the ideal. So then it comes down to, okay, well, what are the forgivable shortcuts? Because there's always forgivable shortcuts, always. I don't care what project it is, there's always a way. And that's where we say, okay, you know what? We're going to wireframe. We're not going to do prototype testing on the wireframing. We're going to move right into high fidelity mockups, and we're going to prototype off of that. Prototyping meaning we'll use Figma or Envision. We'll create a clickable prototype using mockups so that we can fake the experience for user testing so that users can give feedback, we can tweak it, and then hand it off to development to build. Why do we do that? Well, you can do that and get feedback from your actual core users that you now know because you did the jungle guide, right? You know it, it's backed by data. And instead of taking 3 or 6 months to build this thing, because development is always going to be the big chunk of any project like this, you can actually say, whoa, we got it out in front of our users beforehand. We got some very valuable information. We tweaked it, retested it. It passed in flying colors. Now let's hand it off to development. The other thing, too, that we try to do in that scenario, Andy, is we try to be agile when it makes sense. We're always going to be somewhat agile. But the idea of, depending on the client, can we approve a design that has been validated and then hand it off to development so that they're building while we're continuing to design is really what we try to look for. It's the idea of building the plane as you're flying it. It can be done. It can be done very well. You have to make sure that everybody involved is vested in the process to make sure that we get from our starting point to our finish line in a good way.
I love everything that you're saying. It really reflects a lot on my experiences with startups and a lot of product development cycles that I've led through various companies. And so it's very sophisticated and well thought out, yet still simplified for both a startup and a larger company. Let's change gears a little bit and tell me a little bit about you and your background, how you came upon this and how you started the company.
Sure. So it's a funny story, actually. When I was just getting out of high school, I was going to Pacific Palisades High School, and I was 18 at the time. And I found out when I turned 18 that I could sign myself out of school because you're 18, you're an adult. And I was like, the power. Wow, this is awesome. And my parents realized, like, we've got a problem because this guy's not staying in school. I had always been one of those academic kind of guys where if I was interested, straight A's. If I wasn't, I'd be lucky if I got a D. Just if I wasn't interested. So, and it reflects because, my history, I was top of my class, top of the state actually in high school. And then in math, forget about it. I just wasn't interested at all. And so around that time, my parents were like, okay, we're going to take you out of school. You're going to do homeschooling to finish up. And guess what? You're an adult. You better figure it out. And so I was starting to what do I want to do? And I'd always been into video games. So I was doing video gaming and stuff like that. But at the time, my idea was to be a farmer. I liked the idea of growing things, and I was kind of, I guess, odd that way. And I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo to check out their agricultural program, and I was really getting ready to transfer there from SMC, which I had started going to, Santa Monica College. And all of a sudden, I got a job working with a startup called Crave Online, and they were eventually bought by Fox Atomic. But at the time I was working there and I suddenly was making a ton of money, way more than when I was working at Blockbuster over the summer. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of money. This is easy. And I had taken an introduction to the internet course at SMC, and I was doing HTML and stuff like that. And I was just like, this is really cool. And I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna still do my plan, but I'm gonna take a little longer to do it because I'd like to make some money. And out of the blue, I was about a year into that, and I was working remotely at the time, which was early thousands. So, it wasn't very common at the time. And I had an epiphany. I was like, you know what? I'm going to switch my major. I'm going to go do visual communications instead. And I found an accelerated program online at AIU to be able to do that. And I was able to do that while still working. Finished that, and then out of the blue, I got a job offer from GSN, the game show network in Santa Monica, and now we're off to the races. And from that point to now, I had a pretty fun career. And a lot of it was just right place, right time. GSN, they were going through a redesign, and Liberty Media and Sony, who own it, couldn't agree on an agency to do the redesign. So we did it internally. And I was the only designer there. So they gave it to me. I was a junior designer, fresh out of college, and they had me do the redesign. So I was like, this is awesome. And then, I went on to a couple other startups. I ended up working with Zynga, a company called Double Ding that was working with Zynga. So I worked on the Farmville paywall. I ended up going to a company called Zag.com that became TrueCar. They had a good IPO. I was able to leverage that to have a foundation to start CreateApe down the road. I went to work at lynda.com, then it got bought by LinkedIn. So I definitely touched on a lot of brands. TrueCar alone, I mean, they had so many. I was in charge of their partner program, so I was working with a ton of partners like USAA, AAA, American Express, stuff like that. So again, I feel like I was lucky, just the right place at the right time, because I was able to get an experience where, some designers work with 2 or 3 big brands. I was working with like 60 big brands. I kind of always had this scrappy startup mentality where it's like, can you do this? Yeah, I can do it. And then I'd go figure out how to do it and be like, here you go. I did it, So, and then once the IPO at TrueCar happened, I just left lynda.com, moved down to Orange County, and I was kind of talking to my wife about what I wanted to do. And I was like, I'm just going to do consulting for now and see where that goes. And consulting started to get, busier. And eventually it got to the point where I needed to hire some extra people to help me. And by 2016, we started CreateApe at that point. It was just like, we need help. We need to create a company. And, it's been a fun ride. CreateApe is now over 55 people, almost 60 people. And we're continuing to grow, and it's been a fun journey so far. And one of those things that you don't realize you're in it until you can stop and look back and go, wow, we've done a lot of stuff. And there've been a lot of little things too in that time, like, doing some thought leadership, being a keynote speaker at UC San Diego, getting published in UF magazine, like stuff like that. That was just like, at the time, you're just like, oh, that's cool. And then later on, someone points it out like, hey, that's something you should talk about more. And it's like, oh, I guess so. Yeah, why not?
I love that. That's such a great story and such a great application of entrepreneurship, really, is, people say that, you just mentioned that you got lucky, but you create your own luck, quite a bit when you are scrappy in that kind of way. And you take on projects where you say, yeah, I can do that. And then you figure out how to do it and you make it happen. But the reality is that you end up making it happen. And that's the difference.
It's something too, it's funny because there was a period there when I was working at TrueCar, I was already doing like freelance stuff. And it was like, I would say 5 years before I started CreateApe and before TrueCar IPO happened, where I was doing that. And, I'd come home from work, I'd be with my wife and my kids, and then they'd go to sleep. And I actually converted, we were in Century City at the time, I converted a closet into a little office so I could keep working and try to build it up. So I think you're right. I mean, there is kind of that entrepreneurial side, which always excited me when I was younger. It just did. Don't get me wrong, working in the companies I work with, especially the startups, I learned so much. I mean, boy, did I learn a lot from the people I work with. But yeah, I think you're right. It definitely is part of that.
Being scrappy helps for sure.
Yeah, it does.
Good stuff. Tell me a little bit about the growth of the business. Like when you work with a client, what's the engagement like? You build a team with them, and what is that team structure? How does that look? And then how have you been growing the company?
Yeah, so typically when we work with a client, the average client works with us a minimum of like 3 months at a minimum. Usually it's anywhere between 3 to, I would say, 8 months, depending on the size of the project. And when we do that, the way that it works is they come in somehow. Usually it's through word of mouth, and we create a sales call. That's kind of where I tend to spend a lot of my days nowadays, is the sales and marketing team. Okay, hey, we've got someone in. Let's have them sit down. We're going to talk. And so myself and potentially some people from our leadership team, like design or development, will join those calls and we'll hear what they're saying. And it's very organic, and it's very kind of no pressure. It's just like, yeah, tell us what you're trying to do. And if we're a good fit, great. If we're not, we'll try to point you in the right direction. And so they'll talk to us about what they're trying to do, and we'll give some good feedback. And things like, oh, have you guys thought about this? Or, oh, that's a good idea. What about that? And then that'll move into one of two directions. Either A, like, hey, it turns out I don't think we're a good fit for what you're trying to do because of this and this reason. Let me try to point you guys in the right direction. Or, hey, we are absolutely a good fit, and let's start putting together an estimate for the project. Or if we can, and this is what we do nowadays, is can we do a jungle guide? Let's do a jungle guide because it's the next step for what you guys are doing. And once they agree to that, it goes to our research ideation team to do the jungle guide. And then once that's done, we then present it. And then now we've scoped out the bigger project. And again, every time we've done it, we've gotten the bigger project, and then that goes to the design and project management team and development team to start working on it. In terms of growth of the business, I mean, I'll be honest, when 2020 happened and the epidemic, I was really concerned. I was like, oh my God, who knows what's going to happen? But we grew a ton. We almost doubled in size since then. So year over year, we've had, I'd say at least 50% growth year over year for the last 3-4 years. I kind of see the same thing happening this year. It's been a little bit slower Q1 of this year with just the economy and things like that. But we're still, instead of being crazy busy, we're just busy at that point, right? So, and what I like to tell people is just wait 2 weeks. Wait 2 weeks, it'll change. And that's usually what ends up happening. So we're always kind of chasing, making sure that we can grow in a sustainable way with making sure that our core values are being followed. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges as a business owner is you want to grow for sure, but sustainable growth is not a little thing. It's not an easy thing. In fact, I tell people all the time when they talk about my story, like, what's the hardest thing you've ever done? I was like, growing from 10 people to 20 people was the hardest thing I ever did. Absolutely the hardest thing, hands down. Nothing even comes close to being that hard.
Why is that? Why do you say what's causing that?
Because when you're 10 or under, you can fake a lot of things. You can fake it. You don't need to have big processes or things like that. You don't need to have certain team members on your team. You can fake a lot of it and still produce really amazing work, and you're good to go. But the moment you start going past that, you can't handle it all. You need to law the lid. You need to start bringing in a leadership team to do that. And that forces you now to start not looking at contractors, but full-time W-2s and what that means. So now you're having to understand, hiring laws, call it California laws, employee regulations, things of that nature, and trying to figure out, like, how do I keep the essence of CreateApe, of what makes this company so special, this way, as you add more and more people here that potentially could dilute it. Or if you make a bad hire because you're just in a spot and like, oh my God, I got this big project and I need 5 new people, I'm just going to hire whoever I can find. So going from 10 to 20 was the hardest because it forces you to address those things in a way that works. And believe me, I'm not a savant. Like, it didn't just happen. Like, there were mistakes made where I was like, oh, that was a bad idea. I guess we shouldn't have done that. And we had to kind of like pivot. And I guess that's probably the second thing I would say, that you really learn in that 10 to 20 what it means to bend. If you don't bend, you break. So you have to learn how to bend. And that is probably the next biggest thing I think I've learned in that process, where it's like, okay, this is what bending is. This is what a pivot really looks like. And I think that's how you keep momentum. That's how we kept momentum, to just continue to grow.
Yeah, and you have to build documentation and process throughout, so that's replicable. Let's switch gears a little bit and tell me a little bit about the business side of the company. How are you generating revenue? How do you charge your clients for the work that you do?
Yeah, so we typically bill our clients in one of 2 ways. Well, actually 3 ways, I should say. We have our hourly rate. Our normal hourly rate is $150 an hour, which is just a blended rate across the board, which we like to think is pretty competitive with most, East Coast and West Coast agencies. We also do fixed bids. So if it's something where, like, for example, our jungle guide, our El Dorado jungle guide is right now, it might change, but right now it's $30,000. Like, it's, half up front, half when we're done. And then there's the bigger project at that point. When we do the bigger project, more often we're moving towards a fixed bid because we're so sure about the numbers that we've come up with during the jungle guide. We have no issue with saying, normally in the past it was like, well, it might be between 800 and 1,200 hours. Now I could be like, it's going to be $75,000. I guarantee, like, that's what it's going to be. I don't need there's no range needed because we know all of the data and all the facts at this point. But there's a I guess a Machiavellian quality to the jungle guide, because it helps me also, because I know now exactly what the cost is going to be to do this. Whereas before, if someone comes in and says, hey, Andy, I want to make a mobile app for gamers that does this, this, and this. It's like, okay, well, now you got to, like, you're estimating. They're estimates. And, one thing you'll learn in this space is clients don't love estimates, because estimates you can hide behind that. It's like, well, it was just an estimate. So, I didn't know it was going to be this.
It's a double-edged sword for sure.
It's a double-edged sword, right? So now with the idea with the jungle guide was, well, if I answer all these questions, there's no question. I know exactly what this is going to take to do. I know how long it's going to be. We're good to go. And to let you guys look under the hood, is it that way? 9 times out of 10, yeah, it is. The one time that it's not that big of a deal. It's enough that we can either we'll either eat that cost because it's not a big deal, or it's something that's so it stands out so much that the client themselves are like, this is a change order. Like we said 10, we're actually going to do 20 now. And that's something where we can kind of like in the spirit of good partnership, we work it out with them. So hourly, fixed bid. And then we also have, it's an hourly hybrid where it's kind of a retainer. So some of our clients, they have ongoing work for, I almost want to say years, at least months. And so what we came up with was the idea of prepaying for packages of hours, where you can say, hey, you don't even know what you're going to do. We don't know what you want to do. We know that you're doing some social, you're doing some app stuff, you're doing landing pages, you're doing some conversion optimization, you have a bunch of little mini projects, and you have your own clients that you're dealing with. So there's going to be tons of stuff coming our way. Let's create an hourly retainer. And so the hourly retainer is usually in the neighborhood of anywhere between 200 to like 600 hours. And the higher the amount of hours, the lower that hourly rate is. So that 150 can go all the way down to like 95, which is great for our clients that we've built a lot of trust with. So they know we're going to do good work. And the clients where they have no doubt that they're going to have the work to be done. And so they're like, why wouldn't I know you? I trust you. You've done great work. You have almost 50 amazing clutch reviews. Yeah, let's get a package of hours. And, you know, we're still going to work with you and estimate things and get approvals, but it's a way for both parties to win. Basically, we win because obviously we get paid up front, and, you know, we know that, hey, we've got these hours to work on, and then they win because they get a huge discount potentially on that cost. And, you know, you're starting at 95 an hour, you're starting to flirt with offshore at that point, you know, so it's kind of a win-win.
It's great. It's great. Great approach to the whole business side of it. I love what you're doing. Tell me a little bit, you know, if you're forecasting it out a year from now, what would you like to be celebrating?
You know, I think a year from now, what I would like to celebrate is, I would like for us to be able to celebrate doubling our revenue, but not necessarily our headcount. And what I mean by that is, one of the things that I've been looking at in Q3 and Q4 of last year is, we can do things better. We're doing things good, don't get me wrong. But remember, when you go from 10 to 20, right, or you go from 20 to 40, right, the more people you add, the more process you add. And process is a double-edged sword. It can be good, it can also be really bad. I remember at GSN, they used to joke that GSN, the network for meetings, right? Like, it's the network for games, but they called it internally the network for meetings, because you'd have a meeting just to discuss the meeting of the last meeting that you had. And while we're not bad like that, I can see a whisper of that, the spirit of that bugs me, where I'm like, you know what? We all can be more efficient, right? Like, so for example, this year, one of the things we did is we got rid of our video stand-up for our departments. We're not doing video stand-up anymore. We're using Slack. We're posting our stand-ups in there. If somebody has an issue, they tag who they need. And that way, instead of using everybody's time to just sit there and drone on about, like, yeah, I'm working on this. Okay, next person working on this. Remember, because your departments are getting bigger and bigger, we're using the tools that are available to us to be more efficient. And in doing so, it's been amazing for us. We've been able to really find ways to streamline that process. So for me, when you say, hey, what do you want to celebrate a year from now? I'd like to increase our revenue, but not have it be double. Like, if I were to say I want to double our revenue, I don't want to double our overhead or our headcount. I want to keep it close to where we're at. And I think it's doable, because by improving our processes, improving our product offerings, improving those things, I believe that we can get to that point. I don't think that you need to do that. And the reason I know that is because I know other agency owners that are lower than what we're doing, and their revenue is higher than ours. So it is possible. It's just a matter of how you get there.
Love how you're thinking about this, Al. This is really great. It's been a pleasure talking with you and learning about CreateApe. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Andy. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Al Fard from CreateApe. Check him out.